make it at breakfast, wear it to lunch myth is a lie. Hello and welcome to my channel, Haylee Marie Vintage. Today I have a really fun sewing video for you guys. This is kind of a bonus one because in theory this project should be pretty short. We'll see. But I decided to join Stephanie Canada's Walkaway Dress challenge. So she basically sent an open invite for anybody who wanted to see how quickly they could make this dress to email her for a free pattern that she so graciously provided. This is the original Walkaway dress, not a reproduction. I do feel like that's important because you can also go see, I'll link it down below. She has a video where she compares the two and shows you the difference. I also don't prefer reproduction patterns in general. When I've used them, they haven't been great. So I was really excited to have the opportunity to sew this pattern because I was never going to buy the original pattern for like $100 because while it's cute, it's like, seems like it's a really hard one to fit with the reproduction version. The goal is basically just to see how quick we can do this. My plan is I cut out the pieces last night. That took me about 15 minutes, just the pattern pieces. I'm adding that into my clock even though Stephanie says you don't need to. But here on this channel, we do all labor calculations, which means any second spent on this project. Actually, I guess I'm technically at a half hour because I did a bunch of photoshopping with the instructions to make them print really nicely. So I guess I should add that other 15 minutes that probably took me in. And then it also took me a little bit to figure out how to print it. I realized I haven't demonstrated. This is the pattern. I got it printed at FedEx. 2/3 of it worked out great. 1/3 was not scaled properly. So I had to kind of figure that out and print it on my home printer. So I already spent, I think, $24-ish on printing. I'm pretty excited to give this a shot. I'll show you the fabrics I've selected. So there's like the front of the dress, and then you can do like a contrast back one as shown in A. That's my plan. So this here is a really nice border print fabric. I'm trying to find it. It has this cute lacy border. So my plan is for the front of the dress to be made of this, with this here being the front edge of that hem, and then the contrast fabric that's gonna wrap around it will be this nice navy. I just thought this would be kind of a fun take on it because it'll make it a little bit more my style. I will admit this is not particularly my favorite style of dress, but I thought this challenge was too fun to pass up. So I went ahead to do it anyway, and you know, a free pattern. We all love a free pattern. So huge thank you to Stephanie. Definitely check out. I'll also link all her different series of videos about this pattern down below and about the challenge. I think mine's coming out before November 15th, but we'll see. I decided to sew this today because I was supposed to go to the pumpkin patch, but I can't because the air quality here is pretty bad and I am one of the sensitive groups that can't go outside during it. So I couldn't go to the pumpkin patch and I'm pretty sad. So I decided to instead go ahead and take this extra time I didn't plan on having to sew this pattern. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and jump into it. My plan is I'm going to cut it, and then after I cut it, I'm gonna eat lunch and then I'm gonna sew it. So that is the plan for today. This might be a short video. I don't know. I don't know how easy or not easy this pattern is. It does only have 5 steps in it, but we all know that there's many easy to sew 5-step patterns that don't end up being that way. So we shall see, but let's go ahead and hop into cutting the fabric. So because this is 3 pieces, this was a pretty straightforward cutting out. There is 1 of the contrast fabric and 2 and then the navy fabric. For this contrast fabric, I'm trying to make sure that the scalloped lace at the bottom shows at the bottom of the dress. I just think this will be a cute detail that'll peek through the like flaps of the Walkaway dress. This was a really easy cutting job. The biggest thing is these darts are pretty weird, so marking them took a little bit of time, as well as making sure I cut the like slash that's up at the top there. And then once I finished that up, I went ahead and I moved on to cutting the navy. It is really nice to have like the ability in modern fabric to have a lot of fabrics that are over 45 inches. So that way you can cut this all in one piece instead of having to piece it, which is what you would have to do with vintage fabric. But that's it for cutting. Like I said, very straightforward. And then marking the darts for the back panel was really easy. Those are really normal darts, not weird at all like the ones on the front. So like the instructions say, I am starting with the back navy piece, getting that all ready. So here I am just filling in the lines in between the dots for my darts, and then I'm going to be pinning these and sewing these. After sewing these, we are of course pressing them, and then I'm going to go ahead and pin this top to the skirt. The instructions don't tell you to do this, but I was trying to think of how I could get like the best finished waist. So here I am pinking the seam after I've sewed it, and then I am pressing it up, which is what you normally do. And then after that, I'm going ahead and I am top stitching that down. So that way the waist on this bodice like doesn't move. Because this is like a second layer, I just felt like this is what made the most sense for finishing the seam and making sure like the waist part doesn't roll or do anything weird. So these darts on this front of this dress are just plain strange. You have to have a slash for them to work. Here I am just going ahead and I am marking all of the darts in all of the places on the inside of the fabric. You can tell this is the inside of this fabric because of all the little like stringies throughout where like they didn't clip in between embroidery spots. I'm just marking these, and then after I mark these, the first dart they tell you to make is the like bust dart that goes across or like kind of points the bust sideways. So that is the dart I'm of course going to be sewing first. And then after that is sewn, you're then doing that second long up and down dart on the two darts that intersect there. This suddenly makes sense and becomes less confusing the second you sew that first dart and press it, but it was definitely just kind of weird. The darts definitely work here. They're very strange, and I'm a little bit curious like why this is necessary. Because of how tight the dress hugs me, I feel like I didn't need all these darts, but maybe I'm incorrect and that's why it hugs me so well. And then next I'm doing those darts that just kind of sit in the middle of the fabric that I'm pretty sure are like bringing it closer to your body in the back, which nobody ever sees. So again, I'm kind of curious like why all these darts need to happen. And then I am just pressing everything before I pin the shoulder seams. The shoulder seams are the only two parts of the dress that are sewn to each other from the front to the back, which again is just kind of interesting to me. After sewing those, I decided I was just going to go ahead and finish the hem. So here I am first turning the hem over by 1/4 inch and stitching it down. And then after, I'm going through and putting in basting stitches so I can gather and make the skirt look really nice. Which you'll see towards the end of the video when I actually do the hem. And now I am prepping my bias tape. There's nothing particularly complex here. I just think it's important to iron it out of the pack before you put it on so those wrinkles aren't like permanently stuck on your dress. So I used 2 packs of this color, and then I didn't have quite enough for the neckline, so I used a pack of navy that I had on hand because I refused to go to Joann's. I had been 2 times already for this project and I wasn't going a third. And I decided to just give you some spooky footage for fun because she was being very cute and very silly and demanding all the pets, which I fully understand. All right, we have made it to the bias binding stage, I guess. I am sewing wrong sides to wrong sides because I want this to then fold up and over and top stitch on the right side of the garment. I think this generally looks nicer than if you do it the other way. So, and I'm just using navy thread here because I was too lazy to change it out when I knew I was also going to need this navy thread for the navy bias binding I was going to use. And then I don't know if it's like technically correct to do this, but I am clipping curves so that way the bias hopefully lays a little bit flatter and nicer than if I didn't. I feel like I've never seen instructions tell me to do this, but it's just what makes sense to me. And then I am prepping this navy to go ahead and sew it, which will be folded up over onto the proper side. And here I am just sewing that down all the way around. Really, really, really very easy. You just do have to pay attention because you have to make sure you're catching the bias tape. And for a closer view, here I am top stitching that lighter blue onto the sides of the dress. Doing the same thing here as I did at the neckline. This is a little bit easier because there's less curves. However, there are quite a few corners, so I did have to kind of figure out how to make that work, and I also definitely clipped them before I sewed. And then for the button loops, they have you sew basically a piece of bias in half again. So it's just like, I think this is a 1/4 inch then if you're folding a 1/2 inch over, but it is like a gajillion layers of fabric. My machine handled this just fine, so it was fine, but this could definitely be a bit iffy if your machine can't handle as heavy duty of things. I have chosen my buttons. These are the same buttons I used for my first ever kind of gunny sacks-like dress way back in the day. I'll link that in the eye if you feel the desire to watch a pretty old video. But here I have like measured these and made sure the buttons fit through, and now I am just pinning them down to eventually stitch over. And then here I'm stitching them down. The instructions only had you stitch them down like in one row or one spot, but I kind of felt like it looked weird to just have stitching there, so I made kind of like a little rectangle design that just made more sense for me. It also really secured those button loops, because this is like usually not how you do these. Usually you would sandwich these somewhere, because the way the bias binding works, you can't sandwich them somewhere. Usually, yeah, the ends aren't just like out and about like they are on this one. So I decided to hem this just a little bit longer than the instructions say. And here, what you're seeing me do is I am now pulling that gathering stitch I made to ease this in. This is a very round hem, so this is the best way I've found to do this. And then I am pressing that down once I get everything to like the proper width, and the gather is adjusted exactly the way I want. And this leaves a nice clean finish on the outside. Now we are doing the hand sewing here, so I'm just going around the hem and stitching that down with like the kind of invisible outward stitches. And then I am sewing on the buttons. And then the last thing this has you do is stitch some elastic into the back. I've stitched the elastic down by machine, as you can see by kind of those zigzags. And then I am going to be sewing a hook and eye closure into them. They have you do a double hook with eye closure, but I just used a heavier duty like skirt hook closure that would span most of the elastic. I thought this was really interesting on a construction note, because I hadn't really thought about how the back would close, and this does make sense, but it was definitely like a little bit weird. But with that, we are all ready for the reveal. Alright, so you've seen the reveal. I hope you really enjoyed it. Before we jump into wrap up, let's talk about the cost and how long it took me to make this garment. So I have my trusty spreadsheet here. Wow, I say that every time, but I love a spreadsheet. I trust a spreadsheet, especially one I made. Let's jump into the cost and then eventually the time of what this was. For fabric, the fabric cost for this dress was only $20.86. I got the eyelet fabric that I used with the like raw scalloped trimming. I got that for free out of a fabric swap from Pink Mimosa Jacinta. I will link her down below. She is wonderful. If you enjoy sewing, vintage sewing, girly sewing, definitely check her out. So I only spent $20.86 because all I had to buy was the Kona cotton, and I believe the Kona cotton was on sale at Joann's when I got it. And I think I only needed 3 yards of it or something like that. I had a smidge left over, which I'm just going to keep for lining. And then as far as the pattern, while the pattern was technically free from Stephanie Canada, I did have to pay to print the pattern. So that was $26.54. And that does not include, I don't really know how to calculate if I print something on my printer at home. That does not include that. I thought the printing might cost a little bit more back in my graphic design student days. I just feel like printing was really expensive, but I think it's because I was a college student and I did not have income. And then for the notions, I have started to get a little bit more sophisticated on how I am calculating out my notions. So the notions for this were $7.40. That includes the binding tape, the elastic, the hook and eye closures, and the buttons. I kind of went through and I've just done a bunch of like adding up of receipts and averaging to get these costs so the notions are less of a wild guess. So that brings us to a supply total of $54.80. I think that's a pretty good price for this dress. It's very unique. It's very cool. I also, which I'll get into in the wrap up, I actually really like this dress, which kind of surprised me, and I'll tell you why at the end. As far as labor hours, on this channel we calculate in labor to the cost of the garment, because if you were to buy this from me, in theory, I would want to be paid for, not in theory, I would want to be paid for my labor. So I've been adding that cost in. So this took me 6 hours about. Stephanie's challenge says that you don't have to include any fabric prep or pattern prep. So the fabric and pattern prep was 1.5 hours, and then the actual sewing and making of the garment was 4.5. So far, actually, this is definitely the garment I've completed the fastest and the easiest. It's a dress. The only dresses that come close is the wrap dress I made in collaboration with Drew, and the striped kind of peasant-y Halloween dress I made just a few weeks ago. And those came in at 7 hours about in labor, including all the prep. So this coming in at 6 is definitely still a fastest dress. Like, I would agree with Simplicity's statement that it's a fast dress to make, because it's definitely the fastest dress I've ever made. But anywho, we are taking that 6 hours, we are multiplying it by $25 an hour, which is what a seamstress in Seattle makes, which brings our labor total to $150. So that brings this dress to a total of $204.80 for what this would cost if I was calculating in my labor. I guess that's also the cheapest dress I've made as a result of the fact it's the lowest amount of labor hours I've ever done. But let's talk about the dress itself. Here it is. I would like to note I already somehow stained the hem right here with mac and cheese, like the adult I am. I don't know how this always happens to me, but I swear right now when I wear a garment for the first time, I get food on it, which then lets me test its washability right off the bat. This is gonna go right in the wash after this video. I'm shocked at how much I like this dress. I feel like that sounds weird that I embarked on a project I didn't expect to like, but I feel like I've seen so many versions of the Walkaway dress done with the reproduction pattern, and it just seems like the reproduction pattern sucks. Like, its fit is not good. And this one, I was so pleasantly surprised when I finished sewing the dress and I put it on and I was like, wow, this actually looks good. One downside of this dress so far is if I walk up a hill and with any amount of strain with my backpack on, which this is my fault, I need to reinforce the buttons or make the buttonholes just like a little bit less big, because this dress just like actually flew off my body as I was going up the hill. I mean, there's an elastic that connects it in the back. The buttons in the front came undone and I was like, whoops. Like, I walked into work and I realized like half my dress was hanging off me. I was wearing a slip, it was fine. I do want to kind of show a little bit. So like basically the way this dress, I had a really hard time picturing how this dress goes on. So you have the buttons in the front that you have to kind of like adjust where it sits, and then you have this elastic in the back that you just like have a hook and eye on. So yeah, I went with a like really sturdy no-roll elastic. It was probably a little extra for what I needed. So that's how this worked. I also felt like I didn't have a good comprehension of how this dress actually like lays flat and went on your body. So the reason I think this dress does still take as long as it does is the fact that you have to bind all these edges, and anybody who has bound an edge knows like you just kind of have to take your time a little bit on it or it will look like crap. So yeah, that's why, like, that's my theory on why the make it at breakfast, wear it to lunch myth is a lie. I mean, technically, I guess if I started at 8, I'd be done by 2, so very late lunch. If we went with 4.5 hours, I guess I would have started at 8 and had it done by 12:30. So I guess, yes, in theory, you could do that. I think it was really different back in the day. Like, now I feel like people sew to slow down, and then people sewed out of necessity, because if you wanted clothes that fit you well that weren't a gajillion dollars, you had to go and make them yourselves. Unlike today, where I show with my cost breakdowns that like sewing is an expensive hobby today. It would be way cheaper for me to go out and find a basic dress in most cases, especially once you factor in my labor. This was just a really interesting challenge, and I've really enjoyed seeing what other people make. Huge thank you to Stephanie for this free pattern and for running this challenge. I know it's been a lot of work and effort, but I will say I think it's been a lot of fun. I've seen it on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, like people are really getting into it. And so I think this was just, yeah, I just think this was a ton of fun. Other random notes, so when I went to do my reveal, the way I do my reveals is I drive out to a part of the city I don't live in for safety, and I just drive around until I see a background that I like. And then I have usually like a couple dresses with me, so I change in the car in between finding those spots. In this case, I chose my garden in the morning. I was shooting a different dress. I came back in the afternoon and this guy was like, "Are you here for the stumps?" And I was like, "What?" And he's like, "Everyone's trying to steal my stumps." And I was like, "No, I really like your garden. I think it's pretty. Can I take photos in it?" And he's like, "For what?" And I'm like, I think it will make a pretty background for the dress I made. And he's like, "Okay." And he's like, "Yeah, I don't know why people are wanting to steal my stumps." And I was like, "Well, I have no interest in your stumps because I'm socially awkward, as you do." And he just kind of looked at me weirdly, and I realized it was kind of, I don't know, weird sentence to say, I don't want your stumps. So that was my fun experience filming the reveal. I film all my reveals out in public, so I usually have some pretty like interesting interactions. It's that Seattleites either really want to talk to you or know what you're doing near their property, or they want to completely pretend you don't exist, and there's like no middle ground. Most of the time I'm pretty ignored on reveals, but this reveal I had a couple of chatty people because then another person was asking me about my dress and I made it and like the pattern and blah blah blah. Just this was a more interesting reveal, but I hope you enjoyed the reveal because I told a man I didn't want his stumps for it, so you know. With that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video. As always, if you haven't subscribed already, I would love to have you stick around. I have lots of great sewing projects coming up, some very cool things happening in the new year. I post every single Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. As always, I have my Ko-Fi if you feel the desire to go ahead and buy me a coffee. As you can see, I put a lot of time and effort into my channel, so I always really appreciate it. And then, of course, there is the usual liking and commenting down below that really helps me out, and I also just really enjoy all your lovely comments. So that is it for this video, and I will see you next time. Bye!